Taiwan has lived with an aggressive China for 70 years now. It's one of the flashpoints in Asia. The idea that Australians are heading towards that level of fearfulness really did strike me as unusual.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. A banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're going to talk about the way the Australian public sees its relationship with China.
As tensions between Australia and China continue to rise,
Australia's fractured relationship with China has just got worse.
There's a really dramatic shift towards China on all of these key indicators of trust, faith towards China.
A high-tech Chinese spy ship is being tracked on its way to Queensland ahead of large-scale military exercises with the United States that begin today.
In a statement, Defence Minister Peter Dutton has confirmed the ADF has for several days been monitoring the vessel's approach.
Should Australia diplomatically recognise Taiwan?
China has recently stepped up its claims of sovereignty over the island.
And Australia should be playing a role in the defence of Taiwan.
One of this country's most senior national security officials was warning that the drums of war were again beating.
Should we take the first punch ourselves? Probably not.
I just think people need to be realistic about the activity. When there's militarisation of bases across the region, there's an animosity between Taiwan and China.
And we need to find a way to have a productive relationship with China.
It's no secret that Australia's relationship, particularly in terms of our trade relationship with China, has hit the rocks recently. But now we have senior government officials and former ministers basically beating the drums of war. And our polling shows that trust in China has fallen to record lows. So to illuminate these issues, the Australia Institute surveyed a nationally representative sample of both Australians and Taiwanese about their views on a series of questions regarding each nation's security and its relationship with China. And to discuss the research and results of that survey, I'm joined by co-authors of the report, Alan Beam, who's the director of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs program, and by Melissa Conley-Tyler, a research associate at the University of Melbourne's Asia Institute, and she's also currently in Taiwan as a visiting fellow at the Institute for National Defence and Security Research, which is funded by a Ministry of Foreign Affairs Taiwan Fellowship. And I believe, Melissa, you're in lockdown over there.
I am, and it's very good to join you today, Ebony.
Thank you so much for joining us. Alan, I'll come to you. Firstly, can you just set the scenes for us in terms of the Australia-China relationship and where we find ourselves at this point in time?
Yes, well, the relationship with China is in a state of very considerable disrepair. When one considers that it is actually the 50th anniversary of Whitlam's amazing visit to Shanghai, where he had his discussions with Zhou Enlai, that led in 1972 to the establishment of a formal relationship between Australia and China, it would be very difficult from that distance to imagine that we could have got into the sort of mess that we're in now. The nature of the relationship has always been very much focused on the economic relationship. And curiously, two aspects of that relationship are still very strong, most particularly iron ore and wool. But other parts of the economic relationship, coal, wine, barley, these are in very considerable distress. The problem actually comes from both sides. On China's part, they've been pretty sensitive. They've also been, in some respects, ham-fisted in some of the things that they've sought to do. And Australia has either learnt the same lessons or wanted to amplify them, because we also have been pretty provocative in some of the things that we have said and some of the commentary that we've made. China certainly took very, very great umbrage at the over-direct way in which Australia sought to open up the coronavirus in Wuhan, the claims for an independent international inquiry coming across the top of China in many respects was just not well received. And that, I think, put a lot of tension into the relationship, which was already tense.
Yeah.
So it's against that sort of background that we have, at the moment, a heightened level of fear of China in Australia, and that's partly what we were seeking to look at in the poll.
So, Alan, before we go into the results, what is the reason that you wanted to compare the views of Australians and people living in Taiwan?
Well, those of us who are involved in monitoring Australia's strategic position would recognise immediately that Taiwan is right next door to China. Australia is a long way from China. And what we were interested in is perceptions, that in the light of all of the brouhaha which has been going on between Beijing and Canberra, what are the threat perceptions here as compared with the one place that actually has got a lot of skin in the game, and that is Taiwan. So Melissa and I had a number of conversations about how we would approach this, because there are already polls conducted around this subject, but we wanted to get into the more specific aspects of how Australians and Chinese themselves regard China, regard the threat that might come from China, regard the reliability of the United States, perhaps, in meeting those threats. And that led to the poll that we conducted a couple of weeks back, and on which Melissa and I released a paper last Friday.
So, Melissa, I'll come to you now. What did the results from this poll tell us about how Australians and Taiwanese do or don't, I guess, perceive China as a threat?
Well, that's what was so surprising, was that both Australians and Taiwanese see China as very aggressive at similar levels, over 62 and 65%. But even more surprisingly, similar numbers of Australians think that China will launch an armed attack on Australia sometime, as Taiwanese think will attack Taiwan sometime. And I think that is truly striking. Taiwan has lived with an aggressive China for 70 years now. It's one of the flashpoints in Asia. The idea that Australians are heading towards that level of fearfulness really did strike me as unusual. But I suppose the other reason I wanted to look at this is I'm in Taiwan at the moment. And one of the things that Taiwanese keep asking me is, would Australia help? If there were a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, would Australia be there for us? And getting some data from this on what do Australians think about Taiwan, would they support going to war over Taiwan? That for me was crucial. And I suppose what came out of it for me is saying, look, I don't think the Taiwanese should count on Australia. There's a lot of support for Taiwanese independence. So 2/3 of the surveyed Australians said Taiwan should become its own country, even if that meant that China would invade. But in terms of sending troops, much, much less strong.
Yeah.
So only 21% were supporting, 40% not, and just on 40% undecided. So that's a lot less than Taiwan would need to be able to say, yes, I'm sure we could rely on you in a crisis.
Yeah. Alan, did that surprise you?
I was surprised. I was really surprised at the fearfulness of Australians, particularly directed to whether or not China would actually launch an attack, that is a military attack on Australia sometime. I just find that pretty extraordinary, because I can't see, having been in the business for most of my life now, the grounds on which China would do that. So I can only suppose that the boisterous nature of Australian commentary on China has drummed up that level of fear in Australia. And it's not a healthy thing to do, because unfocused fear is actually what stops you from having sound, proactive, constructive policy. I mean, I often think of Wilson's great statement, that you have nothing to fear but fear itself. And fear is not a sound basis for good foreign policy.
And we do have facts on China's military build-up. We know what China is building its military for, and it is precisely for Taiwan and the first island chain. That's no secret. China hasn't been building up its military to go far beyond that. That's its national interest as expressed over and over again in all sorts of policy documents. So the idea that it's directed at Australia, I think, is very much counter to all the evidence we can see.
So that brings me back, I guess, Melissa, to the question of independence. And you've said you were interested there in whether or not the Taiwanese believe that they could rely on Australia and Australia's perceptions there. And the results really found that Australians do support Taiwanese independence, but not to the extent that we would countenance necessarily sending troops to protect Taiwan. Can you just tell me a little bit more about independence there and why you wanted to look at those results in particular?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Taiwan is a flashpoint in the region. It's one of the places where war is most likely to start in Asia. And knowing what Taiwanese want and what they're prepared to do to get it, I think is vital for anyone who wants to think about the future of the region. So it's very clear that Taiwanese want independence. Our results are the same as every other poll that's looked at this. If you look over the last, say, 20 years, because there's a lot of longitudinal data, you can see that's grown and grown and grown. And it's grown at the same time as the proportion of Taiwanese who identify as Taiwanese, who don't say I'm Chinese or I'm Chinese and Taiwanese, but just I'm Taiwanese, that's who I am. And we've now got to the point where that's almost everybody. You've got maybe 10% who don't say that. Taiwanese would love independence, so you're looking at around 2/3 say they would want to be independent if they possibly could. But what I find, interesting for all of us is that 50% say we still want to be independent even if there's a Chinese attack. Okay, and to be clear on these figures again, they say we're not sure that the US will help, we're not sure that we can defend ourselves, but we still want to be independent even if China attacks. So that gives you a sense of just how deep that desire for independence is.
Yeah.
Taiwan re-elected Tsai Ing-wen as president, a politician from a pro-independence party. Her party has, in the past, pushed for a full declaration of independence, something Beijing says it would never tolerate.
All right, overnight, China warning the United States not to, quote, play with fire when it comes to Taiwan.
The United States says there is no reason for tensions between China and Taiwan to escalate to confrontation. The remarks come as a senior Chinese official warned that any moves towards Taiwan independence could mean war.
What about you, Alan? Do you think the Taiwanese can rely on the United States?
Well, the United States policy is a carefully crafted policy of ambiguity, actually. The United States wants to keep the Taiwanese guessing, simply because they don't want to be locked into a commitment to have to go to the aid of Taiwan in any circumstance. And equally, it is to keep the government in Beijing also guessing and on its toes, because they can't count on the fact that the United States won't come to the aid of Taiwan. So it's called a policy of strategic ambiguity, and it is ambiguous. It has the consequence, though, of leaving Taiwan between a rock and a hard place. It leaves Taiwan in the position of looking at the enforced incorporation of Taiwan into China as a province of China, as it's regarded in almost all of the agreements reached around the world in recognising China. And at the same time, it leaves Taiwan exposed to the enormous costs of invasion. And that's a kind of ambiguity which explains why the numbers move around a little bit, with very, very high levels of Taiwanese people wanting independence, but dropping down to about 50% to independence even if China attacks. I'm not sure that level of support for independence would survive direct assault by China. But again, that's part of the ambiguity of it all. And I worry for them. And I think that also shows up in Australia's figures, that Australians worry for them too, but not to the extent that we're prepared to commit forces to the direct defence of Taiwan. I think in the poll, I was personally a little bit surprised that 20% of Australians were prepared, actually, to commit forces. Now, that leaves the other 80% who don't, and I sustain that. But I thought that 20% was a reasonably high number when you consider that we are just coming out of Afghanistan with our tails between our legs, as we have from Iraq and as we did from Vietnam. I mean, our foreign excursions have not been all that successful. And so that figure did surprise me a little bit.
I suppose I would compare it, Ebony, with the Lowy Institute's polling on what Australians do support sending the military for. And, the numbers are quite high if you're talking a genocide being committed by a nation, and Australian forces are stopping the genocide. So about 80% of people will support that. And similar, I think about 75% would support an operation in a Pacific country, a stabilisation, peacekeeping type operation. So you do get high numbers for some things, but not so much for this.
Yeah. Was there anything else that was unexpected that you found, Melissa, in the polling results?
I was interested that some of the wonderful young researchers at the Australia Institute looked at the age correlations, and I was really interested to see that young people, both in Taiwan and Australia, as I understand it, were more positive about independence and more fearful of China. And I thought that was interesting. I wouldn't have particularly expected an age correlation, but apparently there was. So more fearfulness, more support for independence, and more support for Taiwan with young people.
Alan, can you just, I guess, summarise for us where you think we go to from here in terms of repairing the relationship with China? And I guess if there's final thoughts on, this polling and what it tells us.
Look, I do think we have our work cut out to restore anything like a normal relationship with China. It will require a marked change in tone and rhetoric certainly on the part of Australia, but also on the part of China. I think China is not behaving as the great power that it actually is. I think its rhetoric is far, far too strong for a nation which is at the moment ranking at least second in the world, but certainly ranking first in Asia. So it's just not behaving like a great power. That is something which I think China is going to have to learn. But equally, we're not actually representing ourselves as a strong power either. I think our rhetoric is hysterical. I think it's far too much reliant upon the megaphone. It doesn't actually represent the reality of our long-term interests with China, which remain deeply economic. I mean, China accounts for 18% of the global GDP. We can't ignore that. And we can talk about diversifying our markets, and that's a good thing to do. But you just can't do it recklessly, where you're going to say, well, I'm going to find 18% of the global market somewhere else. So the reality of our economic relationship, I think, does have to be restored. What China is looking for from Australia, I think, is not compliance or a caving in. What China is looking for from Australia is respect, not only for what it has achieved over the last 70 years, but I think more particularly for what it is. And that, I think, plays into sensitivities in both China and Australia, which are around race. And that is something that, in Australia's case, we are going to have to deal with. We know that in our Chinese community in Australia, there are current sensitivities about whether the China policy is a reflection on them and their race, and that has to be hosed down completely.
It's very sad considering how long Chinese Australians have been in the country. You know, it's a long.
But there is a history of racism here. The White Australia policy was largely directed against Chinese people. So that is something that is always just below the skin, the political skin in Australia, and it is one that I think our policy leaders have got to address head on.
And almost one of the policy areas that they're worst at dealing with as well.
Well, if you look at the way in which we have not been able to come to terms with our own ancient history in Australia, the history of our first peoples in Australia, yes, I think that it has got to be tackled head on, because I think it's a deep and corrosive problem.
Thanks very much. That's all we've got time for today.
Thank you again, Ebony.
Hey, good always to talk to you, Melissa.
This episode was recorded on Tuesday the 13th of July, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research, including that report and the polling report that went with it. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a ~NTT. Alan Beam is at Miranda Process, and Melissa Conley-Tyler is at M. Conley-Tyler. Our producer, Jennifer Macy, is at Jennifer Macy, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, everyone, and thanks for listening.